So I asked what to present, and if you wanna, we will have time to talk about my career, environmental psychology if you're interested. But thinking about what to cover, I was, I decided to cover a topic that might be of relevance to many of you who might understand or might be familiar with this theory in social psychology, but I have been using this theory within the environmental area. So it's understanding this, how group-based dominance can help us understand our relationship with the natural environment. So this is what I'm going to present. So briefly, a theoretical summary, broadly about dominance over nature that has been discussed in many theoretical traditions. And then I will talk about social dominance theory more specifically, and then social dominance orientation, like as an individual measure or individual construct. And then I will highlight the research program we have developed on applying social dominance orientation to the environmental context. So I will be summarizing correlational, experimental, longitudinal, and some experimental study. And of course, cross-cultural, the work we did with Johan and others. And then I'll talk about theoretical implications of those findings, and then we'll open for discussion. Okay, so the theoretical overview. So as I said, there are many ways of understanding dominance over nature. So to illustrate, because there are many theoretical lines of work, Kluckhohn, many years back, argued that there are 5 main questions that every society, human society, has to answer. And the answers to those questions lead to the creation of cultural values. So these are the questions: what is the human nature? How do we relate with nature and the supernature? What's the nature of time? What's the nature of our human activity and our relationship to each other? So as I said, how societies answer those questions lead to particular cultural values. But I just want to highlight the second one there, that quite a long time ago, he was already arguing that how people in societies answer how we relate to nature can have different answers. You can have a mastery approach, trying to dominate nature, a subjugation perspective in which you believe that nature is too powerful and we just need to obey nature, and an harmony approach in which we tend to fit in with the natural environment. So I'm not going to discuss the other answers to the other questions, but just to illustrate that this idea of dominance already emerged in Kluckhohn's theory of how human societies coordinate. Another example is this now classic paper by White in Science, arguing that the Judeo-Christian orientation and the way they portray the sacred books already portray this, that the humans have the right to dominate nature. Yeah, so that we are images of God, and as image of God, we have the right to dominate nature. So this human domination, he argues, emerges from these religious traditions. There are many critiques of his argument here, but again, I'm not going to go into detail. I just want to exemplify this understanding of human domination has been argued from many different theoretical traditions. Other examples include this view of a dominant social paradigm, is the idea that emerged especially with the Green Revolution in the 50s and 60s, arguing that the Green Revolutions tried to fight this social dominance paradigm that again argues that humans have the right to dominate and modify nature as it pleases. So the idea is that the natural resources are to serve humans. More into the environmental psychology literature, a long time ago, Stockhorst, who is one of the pioneers in the field, he talks about this instrumental view in relation to the natural environment. So that the natural world is seen to have value only as a means to serve us, to give us what we need as humans. So across these paradigms, there is this hierarchical perspective that humans are on top and dominate nature. And we are not seeing ourselves as other species, yeah, that we are also animals in this planet, but we are distinct. We have a different status in comparison to other species and the natural environment at large. Okay, so that was my background because I've been always interested in the environmental movement. And then when I found out that I could study environmental stuff, you know, and that there was a discipline of environmental psychology was a light bulb moment for me. But during my PhD, I got exposed to this theory because my PhD supervisor has written quite extensively on this theory. So the social dominance theory was developed by Sidanius and Prato. Sidanius passed away not long ago, but was an amazing scholar. I was just talking to Jonah that he did his PhD in Sweden. And in a way, he argues that he escaped the civil rights movement in the US and the conflicts against Black people in the US. And he felt that the US at that period was too much for him. So he went and lived in Sweden for many years before returning to the US. But anyway, so these are the main argument of the theory. They argue that all human societies that produce stable economic surplus, so societies that are stable economically, are organized in terms of hierarchies, social hierarchies. And they argue that there are three main hierarchical systems based on age, gender, and another one that's more interesting for my talk is this arbitrary set of systems. That we create different perspectives that we believe this particular group should dominate others, or they have prestigious status in comparison to others. So they argue that the variability and the degree to which these hierarchies emerges in society would differ across countries, but they argue that this is a human universal, that you're gonna observe these three sets of hierarchies in any human society. That's the argument. So they use the model to understand group-based relations and why you have intergroup conflict, why you believe that some groups are they have greater status than other groups in society. And in particular, the idea is that this is perpetuated, this idea of hierarchies and this group-based dominance are perpetuated through institutions, the roles, academic roles, or career roles that people select, that perpetuates these hierarchies in society. This is the overall model that they present. So it's a multi-level model that they argue that these hierarchy perspectives perpetuate societies throughout many domains, throughout our personal interactions, and also our traits that we might acquire growing up, but also that we tend to emphasize in our lives, intergroup level, the intergroup relations that we have, and those legitimizing myths. They argue that there are two main types of myths. sorry, is already there. Some myths that try to legitimate these hierarchies in society that say, yeah, this particular group deserves the status that it has. Although they would argue that this position is completely arbitrary. Yes, if you think about some groups in society that has high status, often those are completely arbitrary. But those myths are tending to perpetuate these hierarchies in society. And they argue that there are other myths that try to challenge those hierarchies that they call hierarchy attenuating, legitimizing myths. So they're trying constantly to undermine those hierarchies or trying to challenge it. I don't know if it's true, but what I heard is that students that go to Tokyo University tend to be much more conservative in Japanese society, and Kyoto students are much more liberal in Japanese society. I don't know if it's true, but if it is true, you can say that, you know, Kyoto University will be emphasized more attenuating, legitimizing myths, you know, being open, challenging assumptions. And Tokyo University will be more enhancing the myths, the legitimizing the hierarchies that already exist in society. Again, I don't know if it's true, but this is just to try to create a practical illustration of it. Importantly for the presentation here is that they argue that there are measurable differences at the individual level. In particular, in the extent to which individuals tend to favor hierarchical social dominance over egalitarian relations. Yeah, so some individuals tend to favor more hierarchical relations and others more egalitarian relations. So they argue that there are individual differences which they call social dominance orientation. There are several definitions for SDO in the literature. Here are just some examples. One's degree of preference for inequality among social groups, an enduring generalized preference towards hierarchy and inequality. But it's this overall individual preference for social hierarchies that exist in society and for inequality that those hierarchies generate. Yeah, so the argument here is that some individuals prefer and desire those hierarchies, and other individuals are against and fight over those hierarchies. There are many ways to measure social dominance orientation. Over the years, there are many versions of the measure. Here are some items that we often use, the short version, 6 items of the SDO6 scale. So for example, we should have increased social equality. It would be a reversed item there. To get ahead in life, it's sometimes okay to step in on others' groups. So someone who favors those items are, you know, higher in social dominance than others. So this is why I have that in bold, that high SDO individuals are those who are comparatively higher in SDO than their peers. Yeah, so the overall SDO score might be quite low and below the middle point of the scale, but we're talking about high SDO individuals in comparison to a group in society, you know, a sample of participants in a survey, for example. So SDO and the theory has been used to understand intergroup relations. But because I had a background in thinking about humans' interaction with the natural environment, I said, well, perhaps there is a link between this preference towards inequality and hierarchical preferences to our relationship with the natural environment. Yeah, so over the years, I've been trying to translate the theory in terms of the natural context. But before I go there, just to illustrate that the individual measurement is quite consequential for measuring a number of things in society. So individuals who are high in SDO tend to be more likely against immigration. They tend to favor ethnic prejudice. They tend to display more racism, nationalism, cultural elitism, sexism, rape myths. They tend to be more supportive for really harsh penalties in court, like death penalty, torture, suspension of civil rights, and so on. So there is a really great body of literature demonstrating that this really simple measure of individual differences can explain a lot of variance in people's preference in normal social interactions. I really like this quote, so this is why I put it there. So high SDO individuals maintain beliefs and those policies and practices that maintain group dominance in a variety of ways, whereas people lower in SDO favor ideologies and practices that try to reduce those inequalities. Of course, it's not black and white, it's a degree, yeah? So it's important to highlight that, but it's just to make the point that it's a quite well-established measure that explains quite a lot of social behavior. So how can we use that into the environmental domain? So I have been arguing that although intrinsically linked to group-based social hierarchies and also intergroup relations, we can broaden the scope of the theory to our hierarchical relations to the natural environment. So we can understand and use social dominance theory and social dominance orientation as an individual difference to understand how we relate to the natural environment and other non-human species. So I argue that the legitimizing beliefs about group hierarchy and inequality in the social sphere extend to beliefs about legitimizing human dominance over nature in the environmental sphere, okay? So if that's true, high SDO individuals are more willing to exploit the environment in unsustainable ways because SDO also indexes human dominance over nature. So it not only indexes how I prefer hierarchical relations in groups, but also our relationship with the natural environment. Does it make sense? Okay, so now I'm gonna show some evidence, some from a bunch of studies we have been publishing over the years. I don't have it here, but one of my PhD studies was one of my first studies showing that high SDO correlates with lower pro-environmental attitudes. But I'll summarize the correlational findings with this article back 2013 in PSPB. There we report 4 studies. The first 3 studies were at the individual level. And across these studies with, study 1, study 4 with general public samples, study 3 with undergraduates, we showed that across several measures of environmental attitudes or climate change beliefs, that high SDO is correlated with lower pro-environmental attitudes, lower climate beliefs, and so on. Yeah. You might notice that the effect size are quite small. Yeah. And it's much smaller than in social psychology studies, looking at how SDO correlates with other measures of, discrimination or sexism. But I find really interesting because if you remember the items and you have there in the paper, the items of SDO, there is no relationship with the environment, no relationship with protecting the environment or recycling, using public transport, so on. So there is no content overlap. In psychology, one main problem we have is that our measures are really correlated. You know, there is massive construct and measurement overlap in our measures. So yes, the effect size are small, but there is no methodological overlap. And in study 2, we look at the correlation at the country level. We got a meta-analysis just published by colleagues from New Zealand. And we got the country level score of SDO, and we correlated with country level indicators of environmental performance. In particular, we had the Environmental Performance Index, is a measure developed by Yale University that ranks countries in terms of their performance. We had data from a really well-known measure of measuring pro-environmental attitudes, and other measures like environmental concern, global warming importance. These we got from other country-level publications like the World Values Study. So the correlation vary in terms of effect size. Some of them are quite moderate or high, but overall, there is a negative association. Yeah, so high levels of social dominance orientation means lower concern about environmental problems, lower intention to engage in pro-environmental behavior, lower climate change beliefs, and so on. What about cross-cultural findings? You know, I already showed a little bit here, but was at the country level. We wanted to test at the individual level across countries. So Johan mentioned the project, the Collective Futures and Climate Change Study, was led by Paul Bain and Yoshi Kashima. And we published the main paper of that study was published in Nature Climate Change. But as part of the survey, we included the SDO measure, so I could lead this publication. So we had data from university students in 25 countries. And to replicate the findings from these student populations, we got community samples in 10 of those countries, just to replicate if the findings were comparable. Yeah, so these are the people who led that was Paul, Yoshi, and myself, and Johan, and collect data in Korea and also in Japan with her husband, Akira. And yeah, the paper was published in Social, Psychological, and Personality Science. So across these samples, I ran a meta-analysis just to summarize the findings. So here are the meta-analytical results. In the survey, we had 3 main measures. We have environmental citizenship, a measure is a more public domain measure, signing petitions, voting for green politicians, and so on. We had a more individual-based measure, personal measure, recycling, using public transport. And we had a more behavioral measure of asking people if they would donate some of the money they might win by taking part in this study to an environmental organization. So these 4 meta-analytical results from the student sample. Again, the effect size moderate, small, but consistent negative. So high levels of SDO means lower pro-environmental attitudes and pro-environmental willingness to engage. And the findings are pretty much replicated in the community sample. We also look at variability of these effect size across countries, and we show that there are quite a bit of variability. This, unfortunately, is not in the article. I think it's just in the supplementary material. But I really like forest plots. I think it's really informative. So you can see that there is a variability. But overall, there is this negative association across most of the countries. But we look at what are the cultural factors that might explain this variability, or the cultural moderators, if you will. So we tested few, but here I'm just illustrating with the HDI, the Human Development Index. So we show that the lower participants score on social dominance orientation, the more they engage in environmental citizenship actions, as I would expect, the negative association. But this effect was stronger in nations with better human development indicators. So the association was moderated by the level of development the nation had. As I said, we tested for other moderators. One was the environmental sustainability index that I mentioned, developed by Yale. The effect was similar, but was weaker. This was the strongest country moderator. More recently, we collect more data, cross-cultural data. It hasn't been published yet, but again, was with Paul Bain, and this time with another Australian colleague, Matthew Hornsey. If you're in the environmental stuff, you know the environmental literature, you have heard of his name for sure. So we hired a company to get at least 200 participants from 20 countries. Was just when the pandemic hit. I have presented these findings, but I haven't managed to find the time to write the paper. But here is just again the meta-analytical summary. Across all these countries, again, a consistent negative association. So higher levels of social dominance orientation means lower pro-environmental orientation. For this study, because we didn't have a lot of space, we had only one measure of pro-environmental orientation using Schwartz Portrait Values Questionnaire. There is this item, looking after the environment, or protecting the environment. So that's the association. As a way of comparison, we included right-wing authoritarianism. It's another main measure of social behavior. And you can see that although it's statistically significant, or not really in this particular study, it often is, but I'm gonna mention later on that sometimes RWA is also negatively correlated, but it's much weaker than SDO. And I'll explain why this is important later on. But again, there is variability across countries, but for this particular sample, you see there is a consistent negative association across most of the countries there. What about experimental findings? Many years back, I'm waiting for someone to replicate these findings. I'm trying to convince a student, but I haven't found a student to want to replicate it. But we did it. So we argue that if SDO supports hierarchies in society, then the association between SDO and environmental orientation should be because exploiting the environment increases hierarchy or inequality in society. Yeah. So we created these hypotheses we call environmental exploitation hypothesis. So we argue that SDO should predict willingness to exploit the natural environment to the extent that resource gain by doing so will help sustain and widen the gap in group-based status to the disproportionate allocation of resource to particular groups. Yeah. So at that time, there is a lot of discussion in New Zealand about mining, open new mining operations. And unfortunately, this is back on the table because the new government was elected last year. And there is these new discussions about mining, opening new mines in New Zealand. So this is why we use a mining scenario. So we create a mining operating scenario. In one condition, the mining profit will benefit the few, would benefit the owners of the company and the family that own the land. And in another condition, the profit would benefit the many, would benefit everyone in the community. And then our dependent variable was mining support measure, how supportive people would be for extracting the minerals. So we argue that SDO would moderate the support depending on the condition that participants were in. So SDO would be most predictive of support for mining when the expectation was to enhance hierarchy in society. Yeah, when the money would go to the few, then when the money would go to the many. So if you're interested, this is the condition and the description of the condition. So I highlighted there in bold the difference between the two conditions. So rare minerals have been found on private versus public land. But overall is that the profits would benefit the mining company and its investors, so enhancing hierarchy in society, or the profits will be shared equally by all in the local community and reinvested to build the infrastructure to everyone, so it would benefit the many. So supporting our prediction, we found the expected interaction. So those high SDO would be more supporting of the mining if it would benefit the few than if it would benefit the many. In study 2, we use RWA because RWA and SDO are really highly correlated to see if the effect would still emerge, and it did emerge. So SDO predicted mining support only in the hierarchy enhancing condition. So high SDO individuals in the mining scenario where the profits would be shared didn't support the operation at all. Yeah, so we are proposing two mechanisms in a way. One is a more straightforward mechanism that SDO not only measures dominance towards other groups, but also towards the natural environment. But another one is that SDO predicts exploitation of natural resources because it perpetuates or enhances hierarchies in inequalities in society. Yeah, so these are two similar in a way, but distinct mechanisms. Okay, more recently, I've been focused on longitudinal findings, and I'm really fortunate to be involved with the New Zealand Attitudes and Values study. I'll repeat the New Zealand Attitudes and Values study. It's led by Professor Chris Sibley from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And he started the project in 2009. And we've been measuring the same individuals since 2009. We rotate measures, but SDO, for example, we have since 2009. Climate belief measures we have since 2009. And there are many, many more measures. If you are interested, then, you know, the questionnaire and the data is not publicly available because it's still ongoing. But Chris is open for collaboration. So if you're interested, I can send you the link. You can check the measures we have included over the years. Chris noted there is a lot of social psychology and political psychology theories have underlying developmental trajectory argument, so and to test those theoretical arguments, you need longitudinal data. Sometimes it's really hard to test experimentally, to design things experimentally. So another good way to test things is to get longitudinal data. And this is why we invest in quite a lot to get this data. So to illustrate, this is under review in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. Here we report 13 years of data looking at how SDO and RWA predicts climate change beliefs. So over the years, we had over 70,000 participants. There are analytical ways to, consider, even if you have a missing data. In our case, we have some attrition over the years, but there are now sophisticated ways to create weights for complete data in those types of analysis. And in particular, we use this quite recent model for testing longitudinal data, the random intercept cross-legged panel model developed by a colleague in Germany. And it's implemented in MPLIs originally, but I think there are now R codes to running it in R. But what is cool about this type of cross-legged model is that it disentangles between effect and within effect. Yeah, because a lot of things we want to know is within variability. If I change my level of social dominance orientation, does it mean that I will increase or decrease my level of climate beliefs over time? Yeah, but it also gives you the overall between effect. So it's quite interesting model. Because there are gender differences in environmentalism, we tested the models for men and women, but the overall findings are really similar. This is how we often represent. You cannot have all the waves because the figure will be too messy, but you just have the time, 1 year before and 1 year after. But you have all the years there, and you have the between portion of the model and the within portion of the model. And you have the, in this case, the climate beliefs as the dependent measure and RWA and SDO as the predictor. But as I said, for women and men, the effects and the findings are quite similar. But overall, here the summary, the main findings is that we observe that within person increases in SDO predicted subsequent within person decreases in climate change beliefs for both men and women. So if your level of social dominance increases over the years, your belief in the climate, in the reality of climate change, and that climate change is caused by humans decreases over time as well. And this was equally for men and women. RWA effects only emerged for men and were much weaker than SDO. So it supports other findings we have that although RWA, so right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation are related, for the environmental domain, SDO is a much stronger predictor. And interestingly, we found a reciprocal association between climate change beliefs and SDO. So that if you increase your level of belief in the reality of climate change and that climate change is caused by humans, you tend to decrease your levels of SDO over time, which is really interesting. Yeah, so it's this developmental pattern that we can get now with large longitudinal data. To conclude, I'll just show this. I find really interesting across the environmental psychology literature and environmental sociology literature. There is this argument that women tend to be more pro-environmental than men, and there's quite empirical evidence for this. But interestingly, within the social dominance theory, there is this argument, which they call invariance hypothesis, that men tend to be higher in SDO than women. So I've been trying to link these two findings. Yeah, so could it be that SDO can explain gender differences in environmentalism? So this is what I'm gonna present to you now. But first, the invariance hypothesis, that's what it means. So social dominance theory argues that men tend to have higher levels of SDO than women. And this average gender difference in SDO holds even after controlling for cultural or social factors. That it's quite stable across different samples, across different cultural samples as well. There are many publications testing these hypotheses. Again, the findings are quite consistent, but this is just the first that I know that has cross-cultural data there, including from a professor in New Zealand that some of you might be familiar with, James Liu. Yeah, so you see the average scores there, the same measure, the SDO6 that I mentioned there, the items, but men scoring higher than women. So we use SDO to see if it explains gender differences. So initial test here, 1 year longitudinal data, and we show that both SDO and empathy partially and independently mediated the gender differences in this environmental value, protecting the environment. So that woman scores higher in environmental values because they score lower in SDO and scores higher in empathy. Yeah. In other words, men tend to be less concerned about environmental problems because they tend to score higher in social dominance orientation and tend to score lower in empathy towards others. We have tested this in multiple samples. I just want to illustrate with another study expanding, because here is protect the environment, broadly speaking, but we tested with the idea that humans are superior to other animals, and we found the same. So women tend to believe that we are more equal to other species than men do, and this gender difference is explained by the levels of social dominance orientation. Yeah, women tend to score lower in social dominance orientation, and this might explain why they score higher in believing that we are more equal to other species. So this was a study with colleagues from Portugal, reasonable sample from the community sample there. Okay, so that's me. I'll just summarize some of the points and we open for discussion. So our research has shown that SDO is also an important variable for understanding hierarchical views toward nature and also other animals. So the theory and the measure, they were developed to understand group relations. But I'm been showing, and others have been showing, that it's also quite relevant for understanding how we relate to the natural environment. So our research also provides evidence that traits referring to human-human relations, like SDO and empathy, can help explain gender differences in human, non-human animal relations. I'll argue that the cumulative evidence suggests that exploitative tendencies towards the natural environment and also non-human animals may be built upon shared psychological mechanisms. So the underlying ideologies of dominance towards others can apply to dominance towards nature and other species. But despite the similarities, between SDO and RWA, we have been shown that SDO has stronger impact on environmentalism than RWA, and which has some theoretical implications. So I mentioned that my PhD supervisor, John Dacht, used SDO, explore SDO quite a bit. This is his main theoretical model, the dual process motivational model, which was developed to explain prejudice there as outcomes. But he argues that these two main ideological dimensions of right-wing authoritarianism and dominance explain this variability in prejudice. So interestingly, they are correlated, but they are not really strongly correlated. But when you put them together in a regression, then explain a lot of variance. Yeah. So empirically, they are really powerful in predicting a lot of things. But his model argues that how these ideological dimensions come to exist, he argues that comes from worldviews, personality traits, and how we are socialized growing up. So in his model, both SDO and RWA are really important to understand intergroup relations. But our findings show that only SDO is the main predictor. Okay. More recently, colleagues in New Zealand have extended this view of these two ideologies, and they have summarized a bunch of literature to argue from an evolutionary perspective that there is these two dimensions of political ideology, which they call cooperation and group conformity. And as you can see, you have SDO and RWA right there. So SDO is on the cooperation dimension and RWA on the authoritarianism dimension. Sorry, in the group conformity dimension. Again, they argue that both dimensions are really important for group relation for social behavior. But based on our findings, and this is what I'm having discussions with Quinton, now we are co-supervising a PhD student together. Because for the environmental domain, these dimensions seems to be the most prominent. Yeah. So yes, there might be these two ideological dimensions for political ideology, for social behavior, but for understanding environmental problems, the cooperation dimension is the most salient. And that's me, and open for questions.